The streets were quiet, but not the peaceful kind of quiet that used to settle over the town late at night. This was the silence of death, of things waiting just out of sight. My boots squelched in a puddle of something thick and sticky, and I didn't have the courage to look down and see what it was. The air reeked of rot, sour and wet, sticking in the back of my throat no matter how much I tried to breathe through my mouth. I kept moving, one step at a time, hatchet gripped tight in my hand. The blood on the blade had dried into black smears, and the handle was slick with sweat. My other hand held the radio, useless so far except for the occasional static that teased me into thinking I wasn't alone. I hadn't heard a human voice since I'd left Marlowe behind. Captain Marlowe. I could still see his face, the grim determination in his eyes as he pushed me forward and turned back into the swarm. His last words to me echoed in my ears. "Find Ethan. Keep moving. Don't stop." My breath caught as I rounded the corner, catching sight of a pile of bodies slumped against the wall of the hardware store we'd raided for supplies. The corpses were bloated, their faces slack and discolored, but their arms were stretched toward the street like they died reaching for something or someone. I felt the bile rise in my throat and forced myself to keep going. "I'm not stopping, Captain. Not until I find him." The faint glimmer of moonlight revealed an abandoned restaurant up ahead, its windows cracked but not fully shattered. I didn't want to stop, but I needed a moment to figure out my next move, and I wasn't going to last long without water. My throat burned, dry and raw, as I shoved open the door with my shoulder, hatchet raised and ready. The place was eerily still. Tables were overturned, chairs scattered, but there were no signs of movement. My footsteps echoed softly as I moved deeper inside, the stench of spoiled food and decay thickening with every step. My flashlight beams swept across the walls, catching a faded menu board and splatters of something dark on the linoleum floor. A faint sound reached my ears, a shuffle, almost too quiet to hear. My heart pounded as I strained to listen, every muscle in my body coiled tight. The sound came again, from below, the basement. "No. Don't. You're not that desperate." But I was. I needed supplies, and if there was anything down there worth taking, I couldn't afford to leave it behind. Gritting my teeth, I moved toward the stairwell, the door hanging ajar. The stench hit me like a wall as I descended, each step creaking under my weight. My flashlight flickered, the beam casting long, jumping shadows across the walls. The basement was a storage area, shelves lined with cans and crates. My stomach tightened at the sight of intact water bottles stacked against the far wall, the labels crinkled but legible. I took a cautious step forward, my boots crunching on shattered glass. Then the groan came. It was low and guttural, coming from the far corner of the room. My flashlight swung toward the sound, illuminating a figure crouched behind a stack of crates. Its head snapped up, eyes dull and cloudy, lips pulled back over blood-stained teeth. The sound seemed to wake the others. I hadn't seen them at first, but now I could make out the shapes shifting in the shadows, their bodies stiff and jerking as they turned toward me. Shit! I backed up, my heart slamming against my ribs as the first one lunged. The hatchet came up on instinct, the blade sinking into its skull with a wet crunch. I yanked it free as the second one came at me, its arms flailing, mouth snapping. I swung again, the blade slicing through flesh and bone, but they kept coming. The shelves rattled as I shoved past them, knocking over cans and crates in my scramble to reach the stairs. A hand caught my arm, the grip impossibly strong, nails digging into my skin. I twisted, the hatchet catching the thing in the neck, but the momentum threw me off balance, sending me crashing into a stack of crates. The noise was deafening, metal and glass clattering to the floor as the swarm closed in. I stumbled backward, my flashlight slipping from my hand and rolling across the floor. The beam flickered, illuminating flashes of teeth and empty eyes as I groped blindly for the stairs. My foot caught on the edge of a step, and I scrambled upward, swinging the hatchet wildly at anything that moved. The shaft, the ventilation shaft near the ceiling. I'd seen it on my way down. My mind raced as I climbed the stairs, reaching for the small opening just above the landing. It was a tight fit, but I wasn't about to stick around to see how long I'd last if I didn't try. I pulled myself into the shaft, my arms burning with effort, and kicked at the grates until they gave way. The groans grew louder behind me, echoing through the narrow space as I crawled forward, the air thick and stale. My hatchet clanged against the metal walls with every movement, the sound grating and relentless. I didn't stop until I saw the faint glow of moonlight filtering through a broken vent. I pushed the vent open, collapsing onto the pavement outside. My chest heaved, my entire body trembling as I lay there, staring up at the dark sky. The radio on my belt crackled. "Anyone? This is Ethan Marks. The station is..." I froze, my hand flying to the radio. The signal was weak, but it was him. It was Ethan. Ethan! My voice cracked as I spoke, desperate and breathless. "This is Ruiz. I'm coming to get you. Hold on." The static swallowed his response, but I didn't care. I had a direction now, a purpose. I wasn't stopping. Not until I saved him. The closer I got to the police station, the worse the town looked. The streets were littered with overturned cars, broken glass, and bodies. Lots of bodies. Some were fresh, others bloated and split open like overripe fruit, the stench of decay rising in waves. The only sound was the occasional groan or shuffle from the undead lurking in the shadows. They were everywhere now, more of them than I could count. I moved carefully, sticking close to the buildings, ducking behind trash bins and abandoned vehicles. The hatchet was steady in my grip, but my hands were slick with sweat, the handle threatening to slip every time I clenched it tighter. Every step felt like walking on eggshells, my breathing shallow as I scanned every corner, every shadow for movement. It wasn't long before they spotted me. I had just rounded the corner of an alley when I saw them, half a dozen stumbling toward me. One of them let out a garbled snarl, its face half gone, jaw hanging loosely as it dragged itself forward on shattered legs. The others followed, moving faster than I expected, their movements jerky and erratic. "Shit," I hissed under my breath, backing up until my shoulders hit the brick wall behind me. The alley was too narrow to maneuver, too tight to run. There was no choice but to fight. The first one lunged, and I brought the hatchet down hard, the blade sinking into its forehead with a sickening crunch. I wrenched it free just in time to swing at the second, the edge catching it in the neck. Blood sprayed, hot and thick, as the creature crumpled, but the others were already on me. I kicked one in the chest, sending it sprawling, but another grabbed my arm, its fingers digging into my skin. I swung the hatchet blindly, the blade catching on bone as I pulled free. My heart pounded as I fought, each swing slower than the last, my arms screaming in protest. The last one came at me, its mouth snapping inches from my face, and I shoved it back with a growl, slamming it into the wall. The hatchet came down again and again until it stopped moving. I stood there for a moment, chest heaving, the alley now silent except for the ragged sound of my breathing. Blood dripped from the blade in my hand, pooling at my feet. I couldn't stay here. They'd heard the fight, and more would come. They always did. The next few blocks were a blur of shadows and blood. I moved quickly, using every ounce of strength and skill to stay ahead of the swarms. I ducked into a school at one point, hoping to catch my breath and find a safe path forward. But it was a mistake. The building was dark, the hallways silent except for the faint creak of settling wood and the muffled groans that seemed to come from everywhere at once. My flashlight cut through the gloom, the beam flickering as I moved, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. Lockers lined the halls, some still open, their contents spilled onto the floor. A child's backpack lay abandoned near the door, one strap torn, a smear of blood across its front. My stomach turned as I stepped over it, the sound of my boots echoing unnaturally loud. I should have turned back right then, but I didn't. I kept moving, drawn deeper into the maze of hallways until I reached the gymnasium. The doors swung open with a groan, revealing a scene that made my blood run cold. The room was filled with them, dozens of them. They were scattered across the gym floor, some slumped against the walls, others standing motionless in the center of the room. Their heads turned in unison as the door creaked open, their dead eyes locking onto me. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then they moved. I ran, my boots pounding against the floor as they swarmed after me. The hallways echoed with their groans, the sound growing louder as more joined the chase. I turned corner after corner, heart hammering, lungs burning, until I hit a dead end. Panic clawed at my chest as I turned to face them, the hatchet heavy in my grip. They were close now, their faces pale and slack, mouths gaping as they reached for me. The first one lunged, and I swung with all my strength, the blade biting deep into its skull. Another came, and I slammed it into the lockers, the metal denting under the impact. Blood sprayed, the air thick with the smell of death, but they just kept coming. I backed into a classroom, shoving desks and chairs against the door in a frantic attempt to buy myself a few seconds. The barricade shook as they slammed against it, their groans filling the room. My eyes darted around, searching for anything that could help, and landed on a fire extinguisher mounted near the window. Grabbing it, I turned to the glass and swung, the extinguisher shattering the pane in a burst of shards. The cool night air rushed in, and I scrambled onto the ledge, the extinguisher still in my hands. The zombies burst through the barricade just as I jumped, their snarls following me as I hit the ground below. I didn't stop running until I reached the edge of the station's block. My legs felt like lead, every muscle in my body screaming, but I didn't care. I was close. The radio crackled to life again, Ethan's voice faint, but clear enough to make out. "Station. Can't. Hold." My grip on the radio tightened, my heart pounding. "Ethan, I'm here. I'm coming. Hold on." I looked up at the dark outline of the station in the distance, the faint glow of light in the windows. I was so close, but I could hear them already. The groans, the scrape of nails on glass, the relentless pounding of fists against barricades. The station was a fortress, but it wouldn't hold forever, and neither would Ethan. The police station loomed ahead, a bastion of flickering lights and shattered glass. I crouched behind a burned-out sedan, my heart pounding as I scanned the building. The undead had swarmed the front entrance, their bodies pressed against the barricaded doors. Fists and decaying arms pounded the glass in a relentless rhythm, a sound that carried over the deathly stillness of the streets. I adjusted my grip on the hatchet, my hands slick with sweat and dried blood. Ethan was in there, alone, likely counting his last bullets as the horde closed in. I had no idea how he'd held out this long, but I wasn't about to let him die tonight. The odds weren't in my favor. The undead outnumbered me tenfold, and the streets offered little in the way of cover. But I had one thing working for me. Their hunger made them stupid. They'd go where the noise was, and I had every intention of giving them something loud to chase. I pulled the flare from my belt, a lucky find in the school gym, and struck it. The red light flared to life, hissing as it burned. I hurled it toward a cluster of wrecked cars down the block. The flare bounced against the hood of a truck, landing with a bright, sputtering glow. The undead reacted immediately. Their heads snapped toward the sound, and the mass shifted, their movements slow but deliberate as they shambled toward the light. Not all of them took the bait, but enough did to thin the crowd at the station's entrance. I didn't wait for them to fully disperse. I bolted. I reached the side entrance, breathless but determined, my ears tuned to every sound. The door was cracked open, held in place by a bloodied chair wedged against the frame. I shoved it aside, slipping inside, and quietly closed the door behind me. The smell hit me first, blood, sweat, and the sickly sweet stench of rot. The dim emergency lights cast eerie shadows along the walls, and the faint hum of the generator echoed through the empty halls. I could hear the pounding of fists and glass from the front of the station, growing louder as the horde tried to force its way inside. I moved quickly, keeping low as I navigated the narrow corridors. Blood streaked the walls, and spent bullet casings littered the floor. Signs of Ethan's desperate fight were everywhere, but the man himself was nowhere in sight. "Ethan," I hissed, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's Ruiz. Where are you?" Nothing. Just the pounding and the low, guttural moans of the undead outside. I tightened my grip on the hatchet and pushed deeper into the station, my every step echoing through the empty halls. The evidence room was at the end of the corridor. The door was ajar, and faint light spilled out onto the blood-stained tiles. My stomach twisted as I approached, the sound of muffled groans growing louder. I could hear Ethan's voice now, faint but unmistakable. "Come on," he muttered, his tone steady despite the chaos. "Come on, you bastards." I stepped inside, and the scene froze me in place. Ethan stood at the far end of the room, his back to me, his pistol raised. The undead filled the doorway, their lifeless eyes fixed on him as they surged forward. He held the gun steady, his hand trembling only slightly, but I could see the resignation in his posture. "Ethan!" I yelled. He whipped around, his face pale and streaked with blood. His eyes widened in disbelief. "Ruiz, what the hell?" "No time!" I cut him off, rushing to his side. "You're not doing this alone." The horde pressed closer, their hands clawing at the doorway, their snarls filling the room. Ethan's pistol clicked as he fired his last round, the bullet tearing through the nearest creature's skull. It crumpled, but the rest kept coming, their bodies piling into the room. "Get to the generator," I shouted, shoving him toward the corner of the room where the controls glowed faintly. "We can trap them in here." Ethan hesitated, but only for a second. He bolted for the generator, his boots slipping on the blood-slick floor. I swung the hatchet, the blade sinking into the neck of the closest zombie. The momentum wrenched it from my hands, leaving me with only my fists. "Move faster," I yelled, grabbing a chair and smashing it against the next one that came through. Splinters flew as the creature stumbled back. only for another to take its place. "I've got it," Ethan yelled. The generator hummed louder as the evidence room's reinforced doors began to slide shut. I backed up, grabbing the hatchet and pulling it free, just as the last gap closed. The undead slammed against the glass, their snarls muffled but no less horrifying as they clawed at the barriers. Ethan and I collapsed against the far wall, the silence almost deafening after the chaos. My chest heaved, my arms shaking as I looked over at him. His face was pale, but his eyes burned with relief and something close to gratitude. "Thought I was done for," he said, his voice hoarse. "You would have been," I replied, managing a weak smile. "Good thing I showed up." We made our way back to the break room, the only part of the station that still felt remotely safe. I turned on the small TV mounted in the corner, hoping to catch a weather report or anything that might help us plan our next move. Instead, we got the news. The broadcast was grainy, the signal cutting in and out, but the message was clear. The anchor looked exhausted, her hair disheveled, her voice steady but strained. Behind her, a map of the world lit up with red zones, each one larger than the last. "This is a global emergency," she said. "The outbreak has spread to every continent. Major cities have fallen, and governments are struggling to maintain control. Citizens are advised to shelter in place and conserve resources. Trust no one." The screen cut to footage of London, its streets choked with bodies and smoke. Paris was burning, the Eiffel Tower silhouetted against the flames. In New York, helicopters circled Manhattan as hordes of the undead surged across the bridges. Ethan stared at the screen, his face ashen. "It's everywhere." I nodded, my throat tight. "But we're still here." He looked at me, his expression hardening. "What now?" I gripped the hatchet tighter, my resolve solidifying. "We fight until we can't anymore." The broadcast continued, but we turned away, our focus now on what lay ahead.